Hi, welcome to Fiberchats. My name is Irina. I'm the host here, and my guest today is Zach Foster. Hi, Zach.
Hi,
Um,
Irina. Thanks for having me.
I love that. I mean, what caught my eye when I saw your quilts is the unusualness of them all. Like, it's not what you like. I mean, somehow, like in my mind, when I'm thinking quilts, I'm thinking like Amish quilts with like the exact stitching and exact corners and everything. And you have some of that, but like you take it to a whole different level. So like one of the quilts that like I just can't take out of my head is that jeans quilt where there's all these pairs of jeans like at different angles. And or like even the last quilt that I saw that you made out of swimming trunks, like I mean it's unusual materials, it's unusual composition, and like it's not necessarily like all under 90 degrees angle. It's like a lot of interesting things happen when you create the quilt. Is there always a story behind it? Do you always have some sort of like romance going on before you start, or how does it develop? Like how those ideas become quilts?
I think of I work a lot with memory quilts, and memory quilts, for folks that might not be familiar, are made out of clothes that have some special significance for somebody, right? So a lot of times that means someone who's passed away, or like in the case of my mom, she retired from teaching, and I made her a memory quilt. So they could be for joyous occasions too. And so when I think of memory quilts especially, but quilts in general, I have come to envision them as kind of containers for stories, right? Because when you're working with significant fabrics that somebody has worn, or that came from a special blanket, or came from a tablecloth that someone really treasured, those fabrics have stories embedded in them. And so what I try to do is to keep those stories with the fabric. So if you're asking me, do all my quilts have stories? I'm going to say yes, 100%. Do I know all the stories? No, not necessarily. And sometimes the stories are, to me, just the process and the making of the quilt, right? Like the bathing suit quilt is a memory quilt. I don't know much of the story of the person I was making it for because the client didn't share that with me. Um, but I have my personal interaction with the quilt, which was learning how to work with a brand new material. And so for me, that's the story behind that quilt.
Well, do you think you will ever repeat that particular experience for yourself, or it was challenging enough to keep you away from it?
I never want to close a door. I never want to say no. I will tell you that that particular quilt was challenging in a couple ways. It's almost a perfect storm. It was challenging in the sense that it was a slightly rubberized material because men's bathing suits have that kind of waterproofing material, which made it really kind of stiff. And I couldn't get the subtle curves that I like to work with often. It was also challenging because of the color palette. It was also challenging because of the bold prints, meant that I could only get the blocks to a certain size, much smaller than that, and the colors would appear muddy when you step back to look at the quilt. So it was kind of a perfect storm. So if somebody asked me, will you make another bathing suit quilt? Probably, but I would like to eliminate some of the storm if I could, right? Maybe it's not so waterproofed. Maybe it's not such bold colors or bold patterns. But I never say never. Why shut the door?
Well, I mean, in that specific case, you were presented with those swimming trunks, right? So you don't have you have artistic freedom of how you're gonna arrange that, but you don't have artistic freedom in sense of like picking colors and like deciding what color palette you're gonna work with. Is that frustrating for you, or like do you prefer to have like complete artistic freedom of picking up whatever you think goes best?
You know, what's funny, Irina, is that when a client reaches out to me to make a memory quilt, you know, I never ask, well, can I see the clothes? Right? It just seems like that would be a tacky question to ask. Uh, so I never say, send me a picture or anything like that. So for me, it is a complete and utter surprise when that box comes in the mail and I open it up. Sometimes it's a relief, sometimes a little bit of apprehension. You just never know. But ultimately, for me as an artist, I find that I have come to appreciate the creative challenge that it presents, right? Being open to the universe, saying yes to whatever comes, and knowing that I've made what, maybe 50 or 60 quilts in my time, knowing that the same skill and creative spark that has made many beautiful quilts in the past can crank it out yet again one more time. And so I've come to have kind of faith in that force, whatever's motivated me to this point, will continue to drive new and beautiful things.
Do you ever panic when you open that box and see what's in front of you?
Well, I mean, honestly, with the most recent, with the Bezu quilt, I was excited when I first saw it because it was so joyful and so just full of life and full of color. Uh, yeah, do I ever panic? No, not really, not really. No, because I can work with it all.
So at some point I saw you like on Instagram talking about how you were like just picking up random articles of clothing you were finding outside and like collecting them and in order to make a quilt. Like why that? Why go that road?
So when I first started quilting, um, I would go to the fabric store and I would spend an agonizing 2 or 3 hours combining the perfect colors, picking out the palette I was going to work with. It was all very stressful to me. And then I would get home and I would be afraid to cut into it because I just spent all this money on really pretty fabric. And so early on, I mean, I only made a couple quilts that way. So early on, it dawned on me that if I could work with some of these cheap clothing items that I find at thrift stores, that I could save some money. And I wouldn't be making such a financial investment, therefore I wouldn't be so tentative when it comes to working with those pieces. And so I first started working with old clothes, just honestly from a sense of economy, just trying to save a few bucks. But what I found and discovered along the way is a couple of things. One, working with the shapes that you get from deconstructed garments. Like for example, if I was working with this sleeve, this soft curve right here, this is a curve I would probably never cut if I had a square piece of fabric in front of me, right? So it gets me working with different shapes. It also gets me working with different colors, right? So when you walk into a fabric shop, it's all very pretty. You have the full spectrum of colors on the wall. Collectors and designers have grouped these colors together because they look so nice. All of that I appreciate. But as an artist, I'm trying to figure out, well, what color collection is me? Which color collection really reverberates inside? And so what I like about working with thrifted material is um, you don't always get to, you get to decide for yourself, would be a better way to say it. You get to decide for yourself what works for you. Maybe you're taking an apron that somebody made in the early 80s that has a bunch of strawberries on it. And maybe you're taking a tablecloth that was someone's near and dear tablecloth, and it has some wine stains and some food stains on it. And you're finding ways to mix these two together in a way that possibly no one else in the history of textiles has ever thought to mix those two things together in that way. And that's kind of an exciting frontier to be operating on.
Like when you look at other people doing quilts, how do you see them? Do you like study them for the technique? Do you try to pick ideas? Do you think, oh, I would have done it completely differently? Like, how do you see other people's work?
I, I I've run, so I'm a creative community organizer. I run a platform called the QUILTY NOOK. And on the QUILTY NOOK, we have small group creative cohorts, and we meet once a month to talk about these questions, right? The ones you just posed. And I often explain it this way, in a way it says, we are hungry jungle cats. We are lions and tigers and leopards and cheetahs. We are on the prowl looking for some shred of inspiration that we can internalize, transform, and then turn back into something that feels personal to us, even if it started outside of us. And so hungry jungle cat is an image that I keep in my mind a lot. So as I'm scrolling through Instagram, or I'm looking at other work online, or at a show, a gallery, and I'm looking at quilts, I'm that cat just looking for a fresh take, a new perspective. And sometimes that fresh take is technique based. Someone's done really well with getting a quilt top to lay flat. And I want to talk to them and figure out how do they do that. Someone might have gotten an irregular curve done really nicely, or it might be conceptually based, right? I was just looking at an artist this morning, and at the moment, I can't remember her name. Maybe we can link to it later. This artist takes household objects like chopsticks, scissors, rulers, things like that, and weaves around them, right? Just creates this little weaving. Like imagine a pair of scissors where your thumb would normally go. She weaves that in. And so I'm looking at all these ideas. I'm just like, whoa, why am I liking that idea? What is it about that idea that is striking a chord with me? And then what would my interpretation of that idea look like? Because I'm of the belief that there's nothing really new under the sun, right? Like, I mean, humans have been working with textiles and fiber for tens of thousands of years, right?
Yeah.
So when it comes to the idea of inspiration, one might even say appropriation at times, there's a fine line between the two. When it comes to using pre-existing ideas, I just say cite your sources, cite who your inspirations are, so you're very clear. My inspirations are a lot of the G-Spence quilters, and we can circle back to them if you would like. And then you just do your best to create something fresh that only you could create from that starting point.
Well, do you see it as taking away from like people who created that originally, or do you see it as a natural evolution?
I guess it depends on one's motivation. My personal motivation is if I like the work, I'm honoring the work. And I never try to pretend that what I do sprang out of thin air, that it comes from nothing, that I'm the originator of this approach or whatnot. You know, I say, no, I got inspired by looking at so-and-so's work. And therefore it keeps that lineage intact. So other people looking for similar inspiration can follow that same chain and find their own inspiration. I would like to think that's a natural evolution in that sense. And I would also like to think that the work I produce inspires somebody else to try something. You know, that's the beautiful thing.
I really hope it does, because I feel like you're taking it to a completely different artistic level. Like that's not the kind of thing you'll see in the department store or even a craft fair necessarily every day. Well,
100%.
what's the most unusual material you ever worked with?
You ready for this, Irina? Snake skin.
Ooh.
There was a designer here in New York, and he says, Zach, I have all these leftover snake skins from some fashion project he was working on. Can you make me a quilt out of those? I said, I don't see why not. Like I say, never say no, you know? And so he didn't have a ton, so I made a small piece, maybe about this big. And it was pretty groovy. I liked it. You know, I had to learn some special techniques. I had to get special thread, special needle, all that, special foot for my sewing machine. But I liked it. Unfortunately, the photos have all been lost. It was on an old phone and I lost the phone. So as far as I know, there are no traces, no digital evidence of the snakeskin quilt. But if one ever shows up, I'll share it with you.
Oh, that sounds great. I also saw that you're making like bunch, I can't remember the exact number by now, of those mini quilts. How did you come up with all of them?
I just play. I love these little things, you know. So here's one I just made yesterday. This one was made out of a bunch of patches that I'd already made for a different project, and they were just sitting in a little Ziploc bag. You know, I didn't know how I was going to use them, so I just put them in this tiny quilt. But what I love about these is that you can experiment. Here's another one. This one I'm experimenting with leaving the seam side of the fabric, so the back side, I'm leaving that out front. You wouldn't do this on a quilt that you're going to use in your bed because this wouldn't be durable. Normally we try to protect this side, but for a little tiny quilt, why not? Or how about this one? I'll give you one more. So this is a little tiny quilt. The metal squares that you're seeing, I don't know if we can get it close enough, are the bases of votive candles, like in a Catholic church. Somebody will come light a candle, it burns down, and this is the only thing that's left. I got these as a gift from the artist Patty Shaw in Seattle, and she collected them from St. John's Catholic Church. And what she likes about them, and of course what really resonates with me about them, is that those are the only thing that remains of other people's prayers, you know? And so by sewing them down onto that little tiny quilt, to me, it's like kind of keeping those embers warm, right? Remembering the prayers of people I don't even know and hoping for them that those prayers came true. And I just feel like I would never have done that on a big quilt,
Right.
but I have so much freedom with a tiny quilt. I can do whatever. I can do whatever.
Do you keep them all?
Well, I keep some and I sell some. People like them, so it tends to be a nice source of income for me. Some of them are special though, and I hold on to.
But like when you create them, or when you started creating them, did you look at it as like sort of a swatch, like trying to, before you attempt something bigger, you'll play it on a smaller scale, or was it always a separate art piece for you?
Well, I like the idea of tiny. I don't know if they were ever test. I mean, I guess they are in a general sense, in a big sense, because you can play around with anything without committing. You can play around with colors. I've never taken a tiny quilt though and made it into a big quilt. They are their own projects. They start small and they stay small. And I like seeing them all together. They're a nice collection.
So when you do the tiny quilts, you do them with hand stitching, right? You don't use
Yeah.
machines. Why? Like, why? What's different for you in the tiny quilts?
Irina, I would ask why not? I mean, hand sewing is so pleasurable in so many ways for a lot of us, not for everybody. I realize there are limitations, but I like hand sewing the tiny quilts just because when you're working at that scale, you can hand sew it as fast as you can machine sew it, right? It's only machines really only save us time when we start working on much larger projects. So there's that. There's the idea of the economy of time. I love the texture that hand stitches give because there's a stitch that Jude Hill taught me, well, that Jude Hill teaches many people. It's a kind of small basting stitch. Let's see if we can get in there. You see these little white stitches here, little dark. That's a little tip I got from Jude Hill. And I just love the texture that it gives. You can't get that texture on a sewing machine, right? And so I also like the fact that it's portable. I can do this anywhere. I'll be sitting on the subway. The other day I went to see the Nutcracker Ballet. I made a little tiny quilt on my way to the Nutcracker. Last night my sister-in-law came into town and we're sitting there on the couch talking about her travels and I was just sewing on a little quilt. So I like that you can do it anywhere. If I had to stay behind my machine, I wouldn't be able to experiment with as much as I do and make as many as I do.
Now, I tell you why I ask you though. When I was a little kid, my mom, my grandmother was a seamstress. My mom knew how to sew. I enjoyed hand hemming, much more than actual machine sewing, and because it's like I'm also like a bit of a perfectionist in a sense. So like to get straight line out of machine was something I didn't master back then. But my hand hemming like looked really neat, and it really gave me this like meditative pleasure in doing the whole. So I would like cut the entire garment, hand hem it, and then lose all interest in it, and like so to me like that was the most sort of like peaceful part and most rewarding part of making a garment. And I was wondering if it's like the same for you with the hand sewing of these little quilts.
Oh, it most definitely is meditative and pleasurable. I really enjoy it. And I know what you mean about hand hemming because there are some really beautiful stitches we can do to hem
Right.
a pant leg or something like that. The little, I don't even know the names, but there's a blind stitch and there's just different things. Or like a rolled hem if you're working with a sheer fabric. That rolled hem is my favorite thing to do. And you can only do that. I mean, in my opinion, you can only do that by hand.
Right. Well, how did it all start?
Ooh, how did it all start? There are so many ways I could answer that question. I would say that I usually trace the history back to about 10 years ago. I'll be celebrating. This is so fortuitous that we're talking, Irina, because when this airs in February, that will be my 10-year anniversary.
Yay.
So that's exciting. Also, congratulations to you for your 100 episodes. That's exciting for you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Um, so I started about 10 years ago. My friends, it was that time of life where my friends were all starting to have kids. You know how it seems a lot of times it's kind of a season. Everyone's having kids at the same
Everyone.
time. And so I've always been an artist. And so I played around with painting, and I played around with screen printing. I played around with linoleum etching and different things. But I always hopped from one medium to the next. And so when I started making this first quilt, I thought, well, I'll just do this and then I'll move on to something else. Well, I don't need to tell you that was 10 years ago and I'm still making quilts. So, I did that one quilt. And by the time I finished that one, I had an idea for a second one. And by the time I finished the second one, I had an idea from a third one. And here we are. But what's interesting is looking back to those early quilts, there are certain threads of the way that I work that remain consistent throughout, that span all 10 years. That first quilt was made largely out of salvaged material from a warehouse. So it was just kind of industrial leftovers. And it was also wonky, I mean, accidentally so, but it was a pinwheel pattern, which is a traditional pattern. But because I didn't know what I was doing, my points weren't lining up. And so my pinwheels were off. At the time, I didn't think that was so good. But now it's something that I embrace. So those are threads that remain consistent throughout. And it was a real pleasure for me to realize that in that very first quilt were the seeds of so much of what I do now.
Right. Well, when you look at your quilts now, does that ever bother you that it's not so precise and so, or like you specifically trying to achieve that look now?
Well, I will say that I'm still a perfectionist in many ways, right? For me, quality is non-negotiable. So like my stitches will stay, my seams will stay, my quilt tops will lay flat. There's certain things that I'm very precise and very particular about, but composition isn't one of them, because I like to respond to the fabric and let the fabric do what the fabric's going to do. And that's where I draw the inspiration for the shapes and for the colors and for the patterns. Now I'm going to put them all together. So I try to go into it with as little of a plan as possible, letting the fabric do a lot of the work, but also using my skill to make sure that the fabric looks as good as it can. And that requires, years of practice and a keen eye.
Well, so when I'm thinking of quilts, right, like regular traditional quilts, there is established patterns. So you just mix and match, you decide on this ornament and like that design, and you put them together in a certain way. Then there are your quilts, right, where there is completely like, we don't know what inspired you at that particular moment to lay it like that. How much time would you say you spend on just planning the quilt versus actually sewing it together?
I mean, it depends on the quilt, but it could easily be half and half. I mean, I was just talking to my buddy Luke Haynes the other day, who's also a quilter, and he says the amount of time that he spends just sitting staring at a quilt on the wall that he's working on is amazing, right? Like, because we are trying to figure out, is this working better than this, or is that working better than that? Like when you don't have a plan, like for example, I've got this beautiful vintage quilt right here. I didn't make this one, right? When you're making a pattern quilt like this, all your decisions are front loaded. So you got to pick your pattern, you got to pick your colors. Once you've done that, it's just production. You don't need to make any more decisions, really. If you're doing something that's more improv, you still got to pick your colors. You got to pick what size you're going to work with. And then you have to make adjustments every step of the way as you're sewing. Am I liking this? Am I not? And when I see something that I like, I try to replicate it somehow, not in like an industrial cookie cutter way where I'm doing it the same way every time. But if I see, for example, that I have two shapes that form kind of like a 90-degree angle and I like that, well, then I'm going to try to make another one, but maybe it's going to be a little like this. I'll make another one, it'll be a little bit like this. It'll still be repetitions of that same idea. It'll create a motif, but it won't be a die cut pattern. It won't be super precise and straight that way.
Tell me about that jeans quilt. I'm just like, I mean, honestly, like somehow to me, it's probably what like brought me to you, asking you for this interview, because when I saw that, I was like, how did he decide how those jeans exactly gonna, I mean, it's all makes sense. Like when it's done, when it's in front of you, right? It makes complete and total sense. But I can't even start imagining like how much time you spend in laying those jeans to make it look so like flowy and so free spirited.
So earlier you asked me if I ever open the box and have a strong reaction. I did with that particular project, actually. Because I was collaborating. I had been asked to make a quilt by a denim company, and they were going to ship me a bunch of denim, and I was going to make it into a quilt. I said, no problem, it all sounds good. And I asked them to send me the scraps and the industrial cutoffs and the misprints and the mistakes, like the things they couldn't sell. They sent me a box full of brand new jeans. And I just got sick to my stomach, because I'm like, I have trouble. I love repurposing, but I have trouble repurposing things that are still perfectly good and usable by somebody else. You know, what I would prefer to work with is, you know, that shirt where it's got a big stain on the front, no one's ever going to wear it again, or it's got a rip on it, no one can mend it. You know, that's what I prefer to work with. But here's a box of perfectly new jeans. I mean, they still had the labels on and everything. And so when I was deciding what I was going to do, I thought, well, I want to leave the quilts as whole as possible, as entire as possible, because I want them to be recognized as brand new jeans. I wanted them to have a sense of the body that would wear them, a sense of movement. And I found myself thinking, as I was kind of piecing these legs together, you know, in various, I create almost like a network or a lace kind of pattern, a big scale lace. I found myself increasingly bothered by very common practices in the denim industry, where we intentionally age a fabric, thereby shortening its lifespan and its usefulness. I can't think of any other industry where that is acceptable. I wouldn't go to the store and buy a brand new smartphone and ask for somebody to crack the screen for me. I wouldn't go to the car dealership and ask for a brand new car that someone had keyed down the side. But we do that with jeans for some reason. And I got plenty of theories about that. So I decided to leave the jeans whole. I decided to leave, there were a lot of the jeans already had the knees were already worn out, right? Somebody had taken like a metal file to them and worn through perfectly good denim. And so that was the impetus for me to leave all those holes that you see in the jeans. And hopefully you can post a picture of this so folks can see it. Because it looks like the whole quilt is kind of a trick of the eye, right? It looks kind of like if I'd made an entire quilt, bed quilt, out of blue jeans and then went through and like cut out holes, because you can see the batting peeking out. You can see the backing fabric peeking out. So you see all the layers, but those are just kind of cleverly sewn onto the back. It's not really entire. And I hope people look at that piece and wonder why we're so okay with this. Why hadn't I, Zach Foster, been so bothered by this before this project? And I think if someone had given me another quilt and it had holes like that, I mean, we're talking holes like 2 feet across, that quilt would be unusable as a quilt.
Right.
So then why are we so okay with doing it with our blue jeans? I'll leave you with that question.
Is there another quilt in your life that you're trying to make, like either a philosophical question that bothers you, or I don't know, like anything, political question, some deep meaning of life question that you telling through the quilt?
Yes, I live with so many questions. I remember about 5 years ago, it had been back when it's probably more than 5 years ago now, the Syrian civil war, when that broke out. And we saw hundreds of thousands of mothers and fathers and children and grandparents walking away from their homes and walking miles and miles and miles into Europe and other places. And I'm just like, what are we doing? You know, and what can I do in Brooklyn, New York about what's happening over in Syria? And that was the first time as an artist that I took a question to the fabric, right? Like that was the intention. I said, I went over here to the chest of drawers behind me and I said, how do we make this work? Like, how do humans make this work? And so I started going through the drawers and I found myself grabbing all the white fabrics and I ended up making this patchwork quilt of all white fabrics. And with that question in mind, how do we make this work? And working intuitively and without a plan, I started by making one long column down the left-hand side. And then I made a second long column that attached to the first one and mirrored any irregularities, right? So if the first column had a small hump in it, the second column had a slightly bigger hump. The third column had a more magnified hump. And so what you saw was these columns, subsequent columns coming together, adjusting to one another, making room for one another, allowing each other to be and responding to their neighbor, right? So all of that for me was part of an answer to the question, how do we make this work on this planet? And that was the first time I'd ever taken a question like that to fabric. I've done it many times since. And I started calling those, at least in my own mind, oracle quilts, because it does feel that answers, or at least responses, maybe not answers, but responses do come out of the practice.
I mean, do you feel like it's your way of coping with the world? Like that's how you find peace for yourself and like dealing with what's happening?
I would frame it just slightly differently. I think yes, in general, yes. For a long time, I was uncomfortable calling myself an artist, using that word. That word just felt like a very big word. I felt like I was a little kid dressing up in their parents' clothes or something. Like that word just never fit me. But then one day I realized, and it was that same quilt, the Syrian refugee quilt, that I realized I am a person whose natural inner constitution is to take my questions about life to materials, to elements. Not everybody does that. Some people take their questions to other people. Some people take their questions to nature. Some people take their questions to music, right? I take my questions to material, to fabric, to thread. And that's, in my mind, the definition of an artist. An artist is someone who brings questions to materials, whether those materials are fabric or paint or clay or steel, it doesn't matter. And so ever since I realized that, I've not had any problem calling myself an artist. So I don't know if I think of it in terms so much as coping, although we all do plenty of that. I do think of it in terms of what do I do with these questions I have?
Right. Well, being an artist is one thing, but you also you used to be a teacher in school, right? And you don't do that anymore. You became a full-time artist. What about the financial struggle of being an artist? Like, is there a struggle of being an artist? Was it a difficult decision for you to stop being a teacher and go away from that package, that insurance, that security of having a full-time job into some unknown territory?
Yes, yes, it was tough. It took me years, to be honest. It took me years. I knew, I mean, we could trace it back to many different dates, I suppose, but I knew about 5 years ago, at least, that my time with teaching was coming to an end. I've taught for 18 years in high school and public schools here in New York and some down in North Carolina. And while I enjoyed much of teaching, it had it I had just changed. I was not the same 18-year-old that had picked education as their major was not the same person I found myself 5 years ago. I have lived an entire life since then. And so I realized I had to get out. And I didn't know what my path forward was. And that became clear over time. And so what happened was I started with quilting 10 years ago, like I told you. I started putting a few of those quilts on Etsy. A few of those quilts started selling for much lower than I would ever charge for a quilt now. And I started developing, my Instagram presence and things like that. With the pandemic then, I made a conscious shift because I've always had kind of a tenuous, no, that's not the word, ambivalent, complicated relationship with social media, in that there are days and moments when I'm scrolling through the feed and I find myself, and y'all know what I'm about to say, comparing my work to other people's work and feeling like crap about it. And I never want my work to be the source of that feeling for anybody else. And so I didn't know how to proceed forward, knowing that social media was key, but not knowing how to do it in a way that felt in line with my personal values, until I discovered a personal calculus that for me has made quite a difference. And that is, and many of us do this, so this is not a unique idea, but for me, my personal filter, my personal calculus is, can I share what I'm doing in a way that inspires other people, that gives them ideas for things they can do on their own? So it's not just, oh, look at these cool quilts Zach made. It's, oh, I'm trying this. How would you do something similar, right? What do you see happening here? And so when I began to see my lane in social media as being that of the inspirer and the motivator and the person who's trying to help people connect to their own creative practice, then social media for me suddenly became uncomplicated, right? Like now I spend a lot of time on it because it's my job, but it's not emotionally taxing like it was in previous times. So I started in that lane, right? As the creative inspirer. And I also started putting not just work first, but myself as a maker first on social media. And I think that's important because that's where so many of my stories come in, that I want to share with people. And so much about the process comes in. It's not just about producing pretty quilts. It's about the ups and the downs and everything in between. It's about the creative times and the dry times. And all of that, putting myself, my person, my story forward, has been met with such warm support on social media. Like people are feeling it. And I'm so happy because I feel like when they connect with what they see me doing, my hope is that ultimately it means they're connecting with some inner source of their own creativity as well, and that I'm getting them to do something. And so all that's a very long on-ramp to say that now has allowed me to leave teaching after 18 years is this creative community platform that I now am the host of. And I view it like a giant party. And I am literally the host of the party. I am there to help people not only connect to their own creative practice, but help them connect to other people in the Quilty Nook, is the name, help them connect to other people working with similar questions, similar techniques, or similar modalities. And so at the moment, we have like 300 and some folks who are members of the Quilting Nook. We do a lot of fun things. So once a month, I have what's called the unblock of the month. So it's typical in quilting circles to have a block of the month, right? A block being a traditional pattern. So this, I don't know the name of this block, but it's got a name. I come up with the unblock of the month. And the unblock is a challenge designed to do two things. One, to get you starting from a different place with fabric, right? So not just like, I'm going to make a patchwork quilt, beautiful as those are, but starting from a different place. And I think here's a real magic, starting from the inside and trying to bring what's inside out. So the prompts are things like, a recent one was make a block that illustrates a threshold that you're currently experiencing. I mean, threshold, people went in so many different directions with that. And some of them are textile, but some of them now are photography. Some of them are paper. Some of them are digital. I mean, we're seeing all kinds of stuff. One that we're doing now and this month, because we're recording in December, is what are some loose ends in 2021 that need wrapping up, tying up, before we begin 2022. And so people are currently working on blocks about that. So it's all trying to help people just break out of a rut, because it's so easy to continue to do the same old thing. I feel it myself. I do, even if someone else looks at it, I'm like, oh, Zach is so creative. No, but I'm just doing the same thing I was doing 3 months ago. So how's that? That's not fresh. So I do the challenges myself too, to keep myself fresh. And I got one here. This, you can even see it because it's meant to be seen from the back. But there are ginkgo leaves sewn in there.
Oh yeah. I saw that on the.
And yeah, and so it's that piece is meant to be hung in a window so that you can see the light through it. It's kind of like a stained glass window, you know, from outside the church. It's nothing special to look at, but from the inside, that's when it really comes to life. So I find myself doing new things. I find myself personally engaged in these monthly challenges. And I know, because the proof is in the pudding, the proof is in the posts and the captions and the stories people tell when they share, that this is really a beneficial practice for a lot of people. So we do that. We do sewing circles. We have visiting artist workshops. Friends come in to lead workshops. We do all kinds of stuff. So if folks are interested in that, I'd be more than happy to entertain any questions you may have. Feel free to write me, because I would love to help you get connected.
The links so they can find you easier and they can join you. Well, let's talk about pricing. So you mentioned when you started that you were selling it for way too cheap. Tell me like your thought process now, because again, like when we as we talked earlier, right? Sometimes you can spend as much time just planning something as making it. Do you have hard time justifying to yourself prices that you charge now? Do you have some system that you came up with? Is it ever like, because you work as a teacher, you have a certain rate, you're totally at peace with demanding higher rate, you understand that like your work has to be paid. With artists, it's just so common that we afraid to ask for what amount of time we spend on something, amount of materials we spend on something. What's your process like?
It's tough because, and this probably won't come as a surprise, even though you and I have only known each other a short while, but I'm not here to make a lot of money, right? Like I didn't go into teaching to make a lot of money. I didn't go into quilting. I'm not a full-time artist to make a lot of money. That said, I still I need a livelihood. You know, I got bills to pay. So how to balance that? I'll just lay it out for you. I will say that, so when I'm working with memory quilts, or burial quilts too is another thing I do a lot of. For me, those are very powerful projects that when someone is processing grief, dealing with the absence of a physical absence of a loved one, and they have come to me and they want this memory quilt made, I want to be able to charge X thousands of dollars for that quilt, right? Because that's the amount of time that goes into it. That doesn't mean that everybody can afford X thousands of dollars. It also doesn't mean that I want to limit my clientele to the people who can afford my work. I have seen firsthand how much comfort a memory quilt can bring, and all quilts give comfort, right? That's what they're designed to do. But memory quilts bring a special kind of comfort, you know, that inner comfort. And so I've seen firsthand, I've talked to people that have been so helped and supported by my work, that I want it to be accessible to as many people as possible. And so I do a lot of negotiating. I mean, honestly, I accept a wide range of prices, probably a better way to say that. I point people to similar projects I've done before and said, you know, this project costs about this much, this one costs about this much. Tell me what you think is a fair price. I also ask people sometimes to think, well, this quilt will take me, you know, 2 weeks of full-time work. So think about how much that is worth to you and your job and what you do, right? And also I'll tie it back to having the community at the QUILTY NOOK. I tell them this all the time, that their support, their presence on the QUILTY NOOK means that they are subsidizing memory quilts for people that can't afford to pay what I would love to be charging, right? And so I feel like if I give somebody a lower price on the memory quilt, it's okay because I have this other source of income that's helping kind of keep things level. And this is all fairly new experience. You know, I just quit my teaching job like 9 or 10 weeks ago, right? So this is all fairly new. You know, if you ask me a year from now, I might say something a little bit different, but I trust the heart will remain the same, which is I want as many people to have access to my work as possible. And I'm trying to find creative ways to do that.
I have another question about the business side of it, and I'm
Yeah.
not meaning to dig into your finances and how you're surviving. It just, I feel like it's such an important conversation for many artists who try to sell their handwork. Right now, the market is like very international. It became a global market. So you competing on Etsy with artists from countries where the hourly rate is 1/100 of your hourly rate, right? Like, I mean, there are countries where the materials are much less expensive. There are countries where labor is much less expensive. How do you deal with the global impact on
I
your
just don't compete. I don't compete. I mean, there's no way, like you can go buy a beautiful kantha from India with an insane amount of hand stitching, hours and hours of hand stitching. You can get one of those for like $100, $200. And that's for the equivalent amount of work on my quilts, I would charge $2,000 or $3,000, right? Like I just can't compete with that. And so what I offer is not only will you get a unique or one of a kind thing, but you'll also have a role in the creation of it, right? Like we will talk, you and me, we will talk on the phone or we'll meet on Zoom like you and I are. Or in case of my neighbors, we go on a walk around the neighborhood. You will tell me stories. I will hear those stories and I will take those stories, swirl them all around and turn them into a quilt. That's something that you can't do with a sewer in Bangladesh, you know?
right?
And that is no disrespect to the sewer in Bangladesh. I'm just saying that there's a certain proximity of me being here in the States for people that are also in the States that want to have that connection, that role to play.
Have you made like some close friends from quilting for somebody you didn't know before?
You know, what's funny is the pandemic has upended a lot of things for a lot of people. And not all of those were negative changes, you know? One of the things that I've begun to notice now that we're year 2 of this thing, is that the people who I considered my inner circle now and at the end of 2021 are not the same people that were I'd considered my inner circle in 2019. Now my inner circle is much more digital. There are people that I talk to on a, let's say, a weekly basis, so a fairly common basis that I've never met in real life, but I would count them as true friends and really good friends. So that's been kind of cool. And a lot of those are quilty people. You know, one of my quilt besties, as I call her, Heidi Parks. She'd be a good one for you to talk to. She and I met because of Instagram, because I admire her work, she admired my work, and now we're a inseparable duo. So yeah, it brings people together.
Do you find that also that because Instagram made it so easy to connect with people from all over the world, and those are the people who are like your people in the sense that they have shared the same passion, they have the expertise to understand the how difficult your work is, like the level of skill you have, and you became close to them, that you're losing the touch with people who are right next to you, right next door?
That is a possibility, isn't it? I think it behooves all of us humans, all of us organic, living, breathing organisms, to not fall headfirst into this digital world. There is still a real life world out there. So whether you're a quilter, a textile artist, or you're someone who buys and sells stock online, I don't even know what that means, but you know, you do something like that, or you're a gamer or whatever, right? Like there's so many ways to immerse yourself in a digital reality that it is important for us to back up and reconnect. And that is what I really appreciate about doing manual craft, because it is a chance to stay firmly rooted in the present, in the physical present. Sure, I'm trying to take nice, pretty pictures, right? But it starts with a physical thing, and at least I have that. You know?
What's your least favorite thing about being an artist? Because like being an artist, you have to be your own marketing director, your own shipping person, your own whatever, writing the romance and being on Instagram and like all of the picking materials, cleaning those materials, like what you name it. There's like thousands of things that you do. What's your least favorite one?
I mean, this might be two sides of the same coin, and maybe it's just the season I'm in, I don't know. But at the end of the day, my brain is so tired because I have been planning all day. I have been executing all day. I have been visualizing and dreaming and manifesting all day, and nobody else is doing it. Like if I don't do it, it doesn't get done.
Right.
And so by the end of the day, I'm just so tired. So I guess I say two sides of the same coin because I love that about being an artist, that I can create the world I want to live in a lot of ways. But the backside of that is my brain's tired.
So what do you do to take care of yourself? Like what's your guilty pleasure, or what's your way of treating yourself when you're feeling tired?
Well, one of them is sewing because this requires no words. Like I don't have to think. This is just kind of a instinctual response, and it's tactile. So that for me is a nourishing activity. Chocolate, let's be honest, I love dark chocolate. 85% is the best percent, and I will take no other percentage. I take a daily bike ride. I'm fortunate to live close to a park, and so I can take about a 30-minute loop around this park that takes me through nice woods and around a lake. I do that almost every day. That's part of my routine. I go on walks around my neighborhood. For me, I need to do something that gets me out of my mind and into my body. And so stretching, yoga, bike riding, walking, those kinds of things, whatever gets me in my body is what I need to be doing more of. I don't always do enough of it.
So like be at the end of the year, beginning of the year, do you have a New Year resolution?
So from one podcaster to another, Irina, I did just record my very first episode
That's
of a
like,
dream podcast that I've been thinking about for a while, and I'm calling it Seam Side. And the idea is that I'll sit and sew and talk with a textile artist for an hour, like you and I are doing a lot, but I'm sitting and sewing and talking. And then I will record that conversation, release it as a podcast, but then I'll take that conversation and distill it down into this little zine. I make a lot of little, let me show you, because it's cute. I'm so proud of it. I make a lot of little zines. Hope the audience at home appreciated all that. So I make a lot of little zines like this. This is one I did with Christy J about how to get unstuck. This is what I did with Kim Soper, how to clean your space. Cut up jeans, Elio Hernandez. But this is the very first, come on, don't be so bright. The very first Seam Side. So I talked with an artist named Emma Freeman, and I took that conversation, and we're talking about not just technique in the practice of it, but we're talking about the inner work of cloth, right? Like what working with cloth has taught us about being more human. And so I'm taking little things that the artist says, and I write my own reflection about it. And at the end, there's some really cute little invitations for the person reading this to reflect. And so this is the big dream project for me in 2022, is to do this monthly. I say that now, it's also a lot of work, so I don't know, but we'll see. We'll see. I'm excited about it.
do you plan like what you're gonna make next, or is it usually like you work on something and the quilt finds you? Like,
So I do have a project calendar. I have a spreadsheet where I keep all my commissions. On a practical level, I try to split each month into two. So half the month is for me, half the month is for a commission. So I only take one commission a month at this point. That may change. And so I do kind of have that schedule, that calendar lined up. So I kind of know what's coming down the pipe. I did just get my very first artist residency at John C. Campbell Folk School down in the mountains in North Carolina. Very excited about that. But that'll be 4 months where I won't be working on these commissions that I have, right? It'll just be me and my work sewing in the mountains in a log cabin. And so once that's over, I know I'll come back to more projects waiting on me. They don't disappear. No little fairy is going to go sew those quilts for me while I'm down south. So
well,
they'll be there.
I'm very excited to see what you're going to come up with in the mountains, because that might be something new and interesting. And
I'm really looking forward to it.
well, best of luck to you with the podcast. I'll subscribe.
Thank you. Thank you, Irina. Thank you.
And whoever is listening, please go and subscribe as well. We'll put the link down, like,
See you
subscribe.
inside.
Yeah. And thank you so much, Zach, for being on my show today. So really loved having a conversation with you.
Irina, it's always nice to meet a new friend. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, hold on.